Hello and welcome to another episode of the Chinese History Podcast. I'm your host, Yiming Ha. Today's guest is Scott Pearce, a professor of history at Western Washington University. He specializes in the intersection of Chinese and Inner Asian histories in the medieval period, with a particular focus on dynasties of Inner Asian origin that ruled northern China during the 4th through the 6th centuries CE. He recently completed a volume on the Northern Wei, a nomadic regime founded by the Xianbei or Särpi peoples who ruled northern China from 386 to 535 CE. Professor Pearce joins us today to talk more about this nomadic regime. Thank you, Professor Pearce, for taking the time and coming on to the show.
It's my pleasure, Yiming. Thank you for the invitation.
All right, so let's jump right into it. So you recently published a book on the Northern Wei regime founded by the Särpi or Xianbei peoples. So I just want to start off by asking you to give us a brief introduction to who these peoples were. They were prominent even before the rise of the Northern Wei. What impact did they have on Chinese history during this so-called period of disunion or the 16 Kingdoms period when China was plunged into chaos after the collapse of the Western Jin in the early 4th century?
Well, going back to origins, so talking about, they're called in Chinese the Xianbei, a reconstruction is the name Särpi by Beckwith and Shimanek. They were a linguistic group, and for the most part, they're not a political entity, if that makes sense. A few who know this might know of the story of Panshihua towards the end of the Han, which is a brief coalition of these people. But mostly they're just an ethno-linguistic group with many small bands. They apparently lived up in or around the Khingan Mountains, the Xingan Mountains, the Daxingan Mountains, which is now mostly in Inner Mongolia, far away from the center of the Chinese world underneath the Han Empire. With the unraveling first of the Xiongnu Empire and then of the Han Empire, they began to move down into the frontier zone of the Yinshan Mountains, the Daqing Mountains, they're now called, at least a stretch of them. And they served there as mercenary military people for both the Xiongnu and the Han at times. They also engaged in braiding, but they weren't really unified populations until maybe the 3rd century, when you begin to see certain groups creating close-knit political and military communities. And among these, there would be the Tuoba, whose name has been reconstructed as the Tabgach by Shimanek, Tuoba, Tabgach, and also the Murong, as some will know. And the Murong were a little bit over to the east in southern Manchuria. So why did this emergent, and I'll call it a nation, drawing on Azargat, whose work I like a great deal. Nations are not just modern phenomena or modern European phenomena. At various times, you see the emergence of tight-knit groups of people who act in a collective way. And I would suggest that among many examples, you can see some in the early Chinese world with the Qin. You can see that with the Särpi people in the Yinshan area in this frontier zone, who were beginning to form close-knit groups. They're not entirely homogeneous, at least at first. These groups contained multiple different ethnic groups, ethno-linguistic groups. The Särpi language, according to Shimanek, and I take his word for it, is probably an early language connected with Mongolic. But in the early Tabgach community, there were also Turkic speaking peoples. So as is typically the case in the world, these groups are not a kind of perfect homogeneous mix. And that's true in ancient times as well as in modern. Their main rivals were the Murong, who created their own powerful state a little bit to the east in southern Manchuria. The Tabgach triumphed over them by dominance on the steppe. They didn't actually control the grasslands north of the Gobi in what we think of now as Mongolia, but they did regularly raids up into these areas in which they captured populations and brought them down. I can't show it on a map, but brought them down to that narrow strip of grassland that lies between the Gobi and the Yinshan Mountains. And so first, that's half of why they did that. They also developed their own power center in the Yinshan Highlands. And eventually, in the end of the 300s, you see the establishment in the Inshan Highlands, in the Datong Basin, of a capital at Pingcheng that for a century or so would serve as an extremely powerful political and military center in East Asia. In the late 4th century, the Tabgach Khagan Shugui, this is Dao Di in Chinese, the kind of the way of war emperor, led his cavalry armies south to seize large sectors of the Yellow Plains that had been the core lands of the Han Empire, of course, but that had already been seized decades before by the Murong themselves. So what's interesting is that it's a battle between two different Särpi nations over control of these rich farmlands. Shugui begins then taking Chinese titles. He takes the title Wei, which we think of as Bei Wei, but of course we have to realize they didn't think of it as Northern Wei at all. They just called it Da Wei. Do you see what I'm saying? It was the Great Wei. Shugui, who became Dao Di, took the title Huang Di. But we always have to remember that he, at the same time, and this would be the case for generations in the Northern Wei, retained the title Khagan. So these are people who carry two sets of major titles, the Inner-Asian title Khagan and the Chinese title Huangdi. And again, his capital was at Pingcheng, which is the city of pacification, modern Datong in Shanxi. And again, this is the beginning of a process that we see again and again. It's a very important element in Chinese history, also East Asian history, Inner-Asian history. These are the so-called conquest dynasties. And the first of these was Northern Wei. And these are regimes that don't originally speak Chinese, who move in and take all or part of the Chinese world. It was not because Chinese were unable to field an effective army. They often had very effective armies. It's really the wealth of the Chinese world made it so attractive to these populations. And in my opinion, that's a larger historical issue, which is peripheral populations all over the world, again and again, moving towards where wealth has been produced and is concentrated. And it's an important aspect, again, of Chinese history and of East Asian history.
You mentioned that these pastoral nomadic populations are moving south, taking over sedentary populations of China. How were they adapting themselves to rule over this sedentary region? Because their institutions, their way of life must have been so different. You can't just transplant a nomadic way of doing things to China. Was there a period of adaptation, trying new things? What were they doing to secure their rule in China?
Excellent question, Yiming. Thank you for bringing that up. First of all, for a long time, up in Pingcheng, which is up in the Northern Highlands, to the northwest of Beijing, as most people know, in the area of Datong, they remained really quite separate from the Chinese world down below. And I'll just sum this up with a famous comment that many of those who hear this will know. It's made in 415 by Cui Hao, who's a famous Chinese advisor to a series of Tabgach monarchs, of Northern Wei monarchs. And someone had suggested to the monarch that the capital should be moved south. And Cui Hao, who was a Chinese advisor who had come up north, says, now living in the Northlands, if there is an incident down on the plains, your light cavalry can go south and emerge, making a show of force in the Chinese villages. How does anyone know how many of you there are? The common folk see this. Here he's talking about the common folk in Chinese villages, and beholding the clouds of dust are terrified into submission. So again, there's the separateness. There are some garrisons down on the lowlands, down on the Yellow River Plains, that are made up of people mostly of Inner-Asian origin. But that's what you see at the beginning. In the process of doing this, they're creating their own distinct hybridized society, drawing on multiple traditions. And some of the best work being done in the field right now is looking at Pingcheng in Chinese and Japanese, but also in English. People like my colleague, Zhang Fan, and others are doing very interesting work looking at this very distinct culture that's a mix of Chinese elements, Inner-Asian elements, kind of elements of Central Asian societies to the West, etc. So it's very interesting. In my opinion, we need to begin to compare this to areas that are even further afield, such as in the archipelago that would become Japan, on the peninsula that is now Korea, of course. and look at the borrowing from elements of Chinese culture, ethical culture, also political culture, and how those are transformed in these peripheral regions. The difference, of course, is the Ping Chung, which is the kind of core of the Tabgach regime for a century at least, is sitting right next to the Chinese world. And of course, what happens over generations, it takes a long time, is a movement of these populations into the Chinese world, where more and more of these people are speaking Chinese. But at least in a provisional way, we really should compare it to the way that Japanese responded to this, that Koreans responded to it, and various other people. Because there's a rich culture coming from the Han Empire and a literary kind of tradition, including, of course, the classics, the Jing, that is spreading to these societies and being moved back and forth there. So again, for the first maybe 80 years, it's a very crude way of dealing with these rich farmlands that they had seized control of. It's really through probably Chinese big men down on the kind of plains, probably taking them. We don't really have clear definition of this, but in the 480s, and this is a very famous and important part of Northern Wei history, there's the development of the equal fields, which is borrowing systems of census and control and taxation of land that have been developed in the Han, evolving them, of course. It's not exactly the same. And in that process, you can see Ping Chung, and it moves the capital in like a decade. Ping Chung asserting a much stronger control over the kind of rich agrarian base down on the Yellow River Plains. I guess here I'll bring up really quickly, thinking about, how did they adapt to these things? We always have to remember when we're looking at Northern Wei that there are historiographical issues, that the chronicles, and it's a fine historical tradition, pre-modern historical tradition, but the chronicles are very much focused on things that interest those who are educated in literary Chinese and in the historiographical tradition coming from them. So the historiographical tradition, Wei Shu, most of all, isn't really looking at a great deal that's actually going on in the northern state. As we all know who've read these things, the main thing of interest is ritual, then maybe taxation, etc. But that's not at all the entirety of Northern Wei. And it would be the same looking at, let's say, Christian chronicles in Europe at the same time. These are not describing a three-dimensional vision of the society or sets of societies. This is just kind of looking at what the history writers are preoccupied with. And I'll just give one example. In the Wei Shu, there are only two mentions, at least in the term I'm thinking of the inner court, the Neichao. But in fact, for the first 100 years up at Pingcheng, it's the inner court that is around the Tabgach Kagan that is actually running the state. And this is made up of princes of the house, of generals, and things of that sort. So we really have to be careful. It's a useful source. There are lots of very useful anecdotes in the Wei Shu that kind of give you hints of what's going on, but we can't simply take it as a kind of full description of what Northern Wei is all about.
You brought up the issues with sources, and of course, for every Chinese dynasty, there are issues with sources. The further back you go, the less of them we have. So I was just wondering, for your research, for others studying this period, how do you go about doing that? You have the official histories and maybe some literati records, but it doesn't seem like a big corpus of sources. What other sources or what other evidence would you use to reconstruct what the Northern Wei regime would have looked like, what their way of life would have looked like? I'm assuming archaeology would play a big role in this.
Exactly. So you use the sources that are richer than one might expect from what I just said. There are large numbers of interesting little anecdotes you can unpack. I draw on anthropology heavily. What are the structures of human beings and what do we do across many societies? Do you see what I'm saying? Inter-Asian or Chinese or any other. I also, of course, draw upon archaeology. And archaeology is really growing at the same time as the study of history based on texts. But we still have to be careful looking at archaeology because there are very often assumptions that are simply read into the reading of the artifacts that come out of the ground, if that makes sense. But again, this is a field, I may see it, I may not, that in the next 40, 50 years may really become along with history done in other places, really more and more sophisticated and able to really attempt, because this is what I believe in, to really see the people who lived at that time without putting our caricatures or assumptions upon them. And that would be true in East Asia. It would be true anywhere. So it's hardly just a matter for East Asia. But again, history is getting better and better. If we as a set of societies can continue to
Yeah.
carry on in this way.
Yeah, I mean, people always ask me like, "Oh, you study the Yuan? Like, are there a lot of sources for the Yuan?" And I always tell them, more than you think, but less than you like. You know?
Yeah, and so you have some advantages because you have Persian sources and
Yeah,
things of that
yeah,
sort, that I just wish I had. Do you see what I'm saying?
yeah,
One of the things that we really need to keep in mind is still how dominant in this period literary Chinese is. And literary Chinese, as you know very well, Yiming, is not simply spoken Chinese. Maybe at one time it came from that, but it is a kind of polite language that's used by people who speak many different languages. In the first place, there are multiple Chinese languages at this time that, at least in linguistic terms, really they're not just dialects, they're different languages. Then there are the inner Asian languages that are coming in. Japanese, Koreans are all able to speak separate languages, but read this body of texts. So it's something that very loosely we can compare, of course, to Latin in Europe, where French people, German people spoke their own oral language, but they all used Latin. And that again is something we have to keep in mind as we look at these. You asked about other sources. One other source might be epitaphs, the mujibing that come down from this period. These are very interesting. I happen to be doing a panel on this at the coming AAS. This is not an advertisement for this, but this is a panel that comes from East Asian scholars. It was organized by Takuma Yoshiyuki and includes Xu Chong, who has done very good work in the northern dynasties. And we're going to be discussing the epitaphs there. But what really interests me about the epitaphs is that these are elites of multiple origins who are coming together in an imperial form, and we're going to put it apart from dynasty at this point, that is more and more building a service nobility. And so you have various people from various origins who are coming and using the epitaph that is, of course, put there by a person who's no longer involved. But families, lineages are using the epitaph to declare themselves and their place in the emerging system. And it really begins to take shape in the kind of early 500s, and then it spreads very far. And of course, under Tang, you see this as the same process. But that's what interests me. They're not all the same, but they're coming together and using the epitaph as a way to declare themselves.
I'll be sure to attend the panel and hear it because epitaphs also becoming important for Yuan studies as well. But I also like to move on with our interview. So, having entered China and started adapting, ruling China, we see a big change, right, in the terms of how the Northern Wei government structured itself and society. And you also brought up the equal field system. And I think this policy starts to emerge at the same time. We see this kind of wholesale Sinicization project under Emperor Xiaowen that kind of really transformed the elites, right? They had to get rid of their Särpi names. They had to start wearing Chinese clothing. The capital moved south to Luoyang. So the question is, why did he do it? Why did he decide to embrace Sinicization? And what's the broader impact that this had on Northern Wei, the state and society?
Yeah, very good question. First of all, I'll just say more generally, there are multiple, of course, Tabgach monarchs in a state and in a court that is changing all the time. So these changes have begun before the Emperor Xiaowen takes the throne. And examples would be, and these are things you know as well as I, would be Jurchen. So it would be a very interesting example to give. Why is the court growing more and more interested in the Sinitic world? Maybe in part because it's simply richer. Do you see what I'm saying? And there's just a pleasure being down in Luoyang, kind of in the midst and the wealth of this highly developed society. That, in my opinion, the early Tagbach Khagans really didn't know that well. Shugui goes down there, the first emperor Daoudi. Taiwudi, that's another of your questions that we may get to, goes down in these areas, but they really remained much more part of an inner Asian world. But over time, this is occurring for a series of monarchs until it arrives at Xiaowen. So Xiaowen, in my opinion, had both practical goals and personal inclinations. And for a long time, we historians have gotten away from looking at individuals, but sometimes you really have to look at particular individuals, and they really can change things because of their own kind of preoccupations and interests. And so, in terms of practical goals, Xiaowen was interested in moving the capital down to Luoyang to more directly control land and taxation. Maybe that's what you're referring to with equal fields. Because again, this was almost certainly one of the richest pools in the entire world, in all of Eurasia. Do you see what I'm saying? And controlling these territories. He also wanted to detach himself from Pingcheng and probably the Neichao, the inner court up in Pingcheng, which stifled his development. He had more and more a vision, at least what he thought he saw in the Han, which was an absolute ruler. We could discuss with Han people whether the Han emperors really were absolute rulers or not, but that's what he saw in the title Huangdi. So he wanted to detach himself from the army, from the circle of generals that kind of constrained him, and he wanted to move down and create a new court. We can, of course, compare this at least roughly with various other phenomena that we see like that, I'm sure in other parts of the world, but in Japan, where in the early development of the Japanese state, they kept moving their court and they were less rich, maybe less highly developed. So another practical goal that he has is to merge elites into a new unified service nobility. But I think he also had personal inclinations. And just looking at him, he is someone who has studied the corpus of the Chinese textual tradition, the classics, the idea of filial piety, and he's really incorporated it into himself, and so has a strong belief and wants to make that the basis of his state, as we've said. And in the process, he's rejecting his own tradition, which is very interesting. And I have to throw out a lot of people really opposed him in doing that. Maybe I'll say more about it. People, more and more people are raising this, but it used to be you just saw, a history written 50 years ago. He just liked it better, so he went down to Luoyang, and there's no mention of it. But people who are up in the Pingcheng area really opposed these changes because it really was the rejection of the old Tabgach way, of the way that had created not just kind of ancient Inner Asia, but what had been created up in the Pingcheng area by the people of Dai. So he prefers the title Huangdi, and as I say in the book, it's almost certain that he abandoned the title Kagan. You don't see it in the histories ever, but we get hints of it in places like the Gashian Cave, if you know, and things of that sort. It's clear that they really did hold both of these titles, but I think under Xiaowen, it was just dropped and they never took it up again. And it was dropped in the process by which, as you say, he is transforming his court. We have to be careful. He's not making all the people who speak the Guoyu, the Särpi language, stop doing it. He's telling people at court that they can no longer speak in the old language. And he's telling them they can no longer wear their Särpi beanie hats, if you've ever seen those, with the thing hanging down. They have to wear the proper headwear as he sees it, that's coming down to him from the Han order. But he's really just transforming the court. Does that make sense? He even complains there are many people up in the north who don't want to make those changes. And there are even people down in the new Luoyang court who don't want to. There's a famous quote that he makes that women in the women's quarters won't stop wearing these North Asian clothes. And he also has a son who says, I don't want to do that, Dad. And the son tries to escape to go back to Pingcheng and is captured and is eventually forced to commit suicide. So there's real opposition to that. It really is interesting. Many people have written biographies of it. Maybe more work needs to be done. Maybe it needs to be pulled into English more of what a interesting, complex figure Xiaowen is. So the effect on his world, there's first of all creation of Luoyang. Luoyang only lasts about 30 years. So it's really dramatic, maybe 35 years. How it has changed. It is a kind of new creation that is down there on the western edge of the Yellow River Plains. Those who live in it, who are rich, really delight in the place. You can see an enormous blooming of Buddhism. If we have time, maybe we'll get to the question of Buddhism. Down in Luoyang, it becomes a huge religious center down there. But it's really only a theater state because he's detached himself from his armies. And when he really needs, or his heirs really need an army, there is no longer an army that he can use. He had brought down a huge part, hundreds of thousands of the men of inner Asian origin from Pingcheng down to Luoyang. But they're kind of like the orphan warriors that they talk about for the Qing. Many of them just dissolve into the population and disappear. And they just don't have a strong army. We could use an example. I don't know if this is fair. Cut this if you don't like this evening. Kind of like what just happened in Syria,
Yeah.
where the rebels are marching down from the north, and there's just no longer an army in Damascus to hold them off. And that's the real issue there.
We should talk about Buddhism because that's such an integral part of the Northern Wei state. It seemed like Buddhism really took off in China during this period, both in the north and the south. But in the north, you start seeing these kind of monumental constructions of temples, these huge caves with Buddhist statues throughout North China, even in the northeast. So why were the Northern Wei, the elites at least, attracted to Buddhism? And what impact did their support of Buddhism have both on the dynasty and for China as a whole?
Yeah. And I'll have to say, first of all, I don't think it's just the elites. There's broad spread among the common population, where you see with these steles that are all over the Yellow River Plains and adjacent areas, where you see large congregations. Maybe they're the elites of those little towns, but large numbers of people, not just the Loyang court at all, is doing this. We have to remember, first of all, that there was a Buddhist presence in the first couple reigns of the Northern Wei, maybe in the first 50 years or so. But Buddhism, in my opinion, was not deeply ingrained in the society yet, though it's in the process of becoming so. So the founding Emperor Daoudi, the third Emperor Taiwu, the great conqueror, these people were not really deeply interested in Buddhism at all. And when you look at the reign of Emperor Taiwu from the 420s, 430s, 440s into about 452, he at some point turned against Buddhism, as I'm sure you know, and he attempted to suppress it. People argue about why. We could look at all the reasons. It's accruing wealth on its own. It's a rival center of kind of organization, etc. He, at some point in Guangzhou, in kind of the Wei River Valley, found weapons in a Buddhist monastery. So that's at least supposedly what set him off. But he was very against it, and he attempted to destroy it. On the one hand, putting forth a state Taoist religion, which many of those who hear this will know, led by Ko Chen-zhi. But I also think putting forth kind of other kinds of religious images and ideas to the inner Asians of his army, which would include the Gashian cave, which was supposedly discovered way up in the north, up in the Kingans, huge distance from the Pingcheng capital. So he is playing these games in multiple ways. But as soon as Taiwu dies or is killed by his eunuch, as some will know, his heir, his grandson, immediately turns back to Buddhism. So it's clear that by this time it really had, probably in just a couple generations, kind of really deeply permeated these areas. There is, as you'll know, a rare historiographical event, which is a monograph, a jur, that's on Buddhism and Taoism in the Wei Shu. So that shows the interest. It's very interesting. It's useful to read. Other things need to be looked at as well. We need to get a sense more of why in a couple generations Buddhism just suddenly began to spread through the Pingcheng area. It really is a dramatic event. And of course, similar things are going on down in the Yangtze Empire, centered on Jiankang, in very interesting ways as well. But that's a different picture because I'll just put this forth now. Those really are kind of different but parallel kind of state systems and sets of societies down along the Yangtze and up in the Yellow River plains there. At any rate, it immediately revives in the mid 400s with the death of Taiwu. And as you said, you see the building of the Yungang temples, which are magnificent, huge set of temples. There are probably different reasons why different people like it. That's an awfully good question. I think the dynasty, the Northern Wei dynasty, likes it because it represents Northern Wei emperors and or Kagan as Buddhas themselves. So it's not claiming the Chakravartin king, it is claiming that we are Buddhas. So it's very much an effort directly to take this religion and control it and use it for the dynasty. And again, in contrast to what you see down in the Yangtze region, you also see really quite successful efforts to control Buddhism and to appoint, he's not a pope, but an administrator of all Buddhism in the realm. Even if people escape this, you occasionally see Buddhists leading rebellions, but it is a tight control that the state puts over this while it's attempting to do this. And it's really continuing on into the Tang, where we continue to see this as well.
Well, that's very interesting, and it's completely different from the Yuan. I mean, you see in the Yuan, right, the Kublai also converted to Buddhism, but he's not claiming Buddhahood. He's a Chakravartin and he has a religious teacher, but it seemed the Tabgach had a whole different way of doing things. Well, since you brought up the issue of North and South, I guess we should turn from Buddhism to more violent discussions of this period, which is commonly known as the Northern and Southern dynasties, because the remnants of the Jin court fled south, they established Eastern Jin, and that crystallized into a series of Han Chinese regimes down in the Yangtze River Delta. And the Northern Wei launched several campaigns of conquest throughout its existence to conquer the south. These all failed, but at several points they came very close to taking Jiankang, the capital, modern-day Nanjing. And as we all know, it was ultimately the Mongols who became the first nomadic group to unify all of China. But was the Northern Wei, was there ever a possibility that they could have conquered South China and unified China? Or was there just simply not enough state capacity for them to undertake these military expeditions?
Yeah. So, in my opinion, the case that most represents that possibility would be at the end of his reign, Taiwu Di, the third emperor. He was also known in Turkic as the Wolf Lord, as the Bori Beg, if you've ever heard that. So he's very much an Inner-Asian, at least has deep Inner-Asian roots. And in the year 450, just 2 years before his death, he led a huge campaign army down to the south. Um, he arrived on the northern bank of the Yangtze on New Year's Day of what we call 451, of course. That's not the real year that they had. He's right across from Nanjing, but then he withdraws. And there are multiple problems. First of all, so this is in winter, of course, but his people are just not used to the kind of southern area. It's hot. Do you see what I'm saying? Can't have been that hot in January, but it's still hot for them. There's logistics. So after he turns back, he just doesn't have food. And they had swept past multiple fortified cities, which they had not taken. And coming back, his army, which is hundreds of thousands of men, are just starving. They cannot get into these cities where there are loyalists for the regime who will not give it up. But I think the most fundamental issue is nautical technology. Uh, they just don't have the Tabgach, the Northern Wei, or Chinese who are now kind of serving within the regime. They just don't have the nautical technology that you need. And this, of course, would be riverine technology or riverine boats, but they don't even have that. They're thinking about crossing the Yangtze after he arrives on New Year 451. And they're thinking about making reed rafts with which to push across. And you already see in the Chinese world of the Yangtze, I'm sure of the Fujian coast as well, certainly of the Yangtze, a much higher development of nautical technology. And I think that's the real issue. They just did not have the capacity. You do the Mongols, so you'll know this better than I. But when the Mongols formed fleets and armadas, they were using Koreans and Chinese. Mongols were not building these things themselves. And I think that's the issue. You know, the Yangtze is very broad where Nanjing is. You cannot get your men on horses to swim across or use reed rafts or something of that sort. So they just did not have the capacity.
Yeah, absolutely. The Mongols, once they realized it, they constructed huge fleets, and that ultimately helped them turn the tide. But we should move on. You mentioned some issues with Xiaowen's move from Pingcheng to Luoyang, some institutional problems, social problems. And this, I think, kind of factors into the collapse of the Northern Wei, which happens not that long after he dies. So why did this regime collapse?
Yeah. And the problems begin about 30 years. He, at least in a practical way, moved the capital in 493. And you begin to see unrest and collapse of the northern garrisons in 523. So it's about exactly 30 years later. And he, of course, died in 499. So this is decades after Xiaowen himself had died. But it is, in my opinion, really an increasing distance. He has distanced himself from his army. I'm sure Xiaowen did this for multiple reasons, but it's really that he wished to set himself up above the kind of collegial mode of government with his generals that had been the norm heretofore. And there really was a collegiality. He's trying to create an absolute rule, drawing on Chinese tradition. But again, I can't say that the Chinese tradition is absolute rule, but that's his image of it. And in the process, he creates really, I'll borrow Clifford Geertz's term here, a theater state. He less and less has an effective military which he can use. He leads, maybe this is part of what you were talking about, a few campaigns pushing down into the kind of liminal zone between the southern dynasties and Northern Wei. But I would have to say in the 490s, these are not really practical campaigns at all. They're just kind of pushing down a little bit, and they don't do anything effectively whatsoever. So there's a real decay of these armies. The other part of the army that have been left in the north is no longer at Pingcheng. That's why Pingcheng fails, struggling with Xiaowen. They're up in the northern garrisons, where again, there are hundreds of thousands of men. These are complex bodies of men who are from the old Northern Wei army, together with kind of convicts who had been sent up there. Turkic speaking people, they're probably Turkic speaking people of the Gaucha. So these northern garrisons are kind of a real hodgepodge of different groups up there. But that is where the real strength of the Northern Wei army remains. And Luoyang is just more and more becoming distanced from these people. They feel like they are oppressed. You know, the people sent up from Luoyang across the Yinshan Mountains to take care of the garrisons. There are at least complaints. It's hard for us to know what's really going on, that the kind of local garrison populations are being kind of ripped off by these people, that they're simply using them as a kind of source of income and things of that sort. So there's really an alienation. At the same time, there's also this thing that they call the late antiquity ice age that seems to be creating kind of more and more climactic problems up north, so that the peoples, I hope everybody's following me, I'm sure you already make, so that the actual kind of nomadic state that is to the north of the garrisons, which is the Rouran, that's our Chinese transcription. I don't think we have their real name. The Rouran are eventually pushing their way down because the climate for actual nomads raising sheep and goats up on the grasslands to the north, it's becoming more and more difficult. So eventually Rouran in the year 523 push into the garrisons, and then the garrisons simply collapse. It's this long chain of kind of artificially constructed military centers that's north of the Yinshan of the Daqing Mountains. They simply collapse. There's internal kind of uprising. There is flight, and hundreds of thousands of these military men come across the Yinshan, past Pingcheng, down into the Yellow River Plains, and also into the region of Taiyuan, as you probably know. And these are simply refugees. And that just creates an enormous problem for the court at Luoyang, because most of these, or at least many of these, are very effective military people, and they begin to recreate armies that are no longer led by generals that are sent from Luoyang, if that makes sense. And that's where the successor regimes come out of, in the Eastern Wei and the Western Wei. And the Northern Wei, with its capital at Luoyang, within about a decade simply collapses. One of these armies comes down and seizes Luoyang, and it's a very famous story, kills the empress who is the regent for the boy emperor. They throw her into the Yellow River, and that's really the end of Luoyang. So it's maybe a mix of climate factors that are exacerbating these issues, but then again, the alienation and anger of these people who had been left up there.
I see. But just a quick clarifying question, because you mentioned that most of the Northern Wei's military strength was concentrated up in the north in these garrisons who seem to be defending against the Rouran. Does it seem fair to say that the Tabgach rulers considered the Rouran more of a threat than the southern Chinese regimes? Because otherwise they would move more of their armies south, right?
True. Yeah, I don't think they consider the Yangtze regimes a major threat.
Okay.
There are occasional incursions under the Song. They come up into those areas. But they had brought maybe half the army down to Luoyang and then put half the army, these are rough figures, up in the northern garrisons. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
So they did have an army up at Luoyang. So
I see. So what happens to the Northern Wei after, the fall of Luoyang? You mentioned briefly that there were these successor regimes of Eastern Wei and then Western Wei. And then what's the story after that?
So in my book, I end it with the killing of the empress who is the regent. And that's just a powerful, tragic issue. And then you can see Luoyang almost becomes it's kind of abandoned by the armies. And those who were still at Luoyang must have been in extremely difficult circumstances because it's no longer the political or military center, but there are still people living there. And there are occasional massacres and things that go on. And then at two new centers, Western Wei is out in the Wei River Valley in Guangxi, Guangzhong. There is kind of one of these branches of the old Northern Wei military leadership is creating Western Wei there. And then really up at Taiyuan for Eastern Wei, Gao Huan, he's a very famous figure, who again is maybe he's mixed blood. He's Chinese Särpi. People are not sure about that. He creates his own kind of political military order up there. And these two regimes for decades continue to have people of the Northern Wei ruling house who are no longer really Tabgach. We haven't got into that. They have changed their name to Yuan. And we could discuss that.
We should, yeah.
Yes. Is there a linkage? It's very interesting. But they had taken the surname Yuan, which is, of course, what the Mongols did 800 years later, or whatever it is, 700 years later. But these are really puppets, and you see new military establishments going on. What I'm working on right now is a book. That was what my original PhD thesis was on, is looking at the successor regimes in the 500s. Those are very interesting. In the process, you see a number of things going on, including a kind of cultural movement and change. And there are multiple fields of Chinese culture at this time. But these people are moving into being Chinese, at least in the sense of speaking a Chinese language. Do you see what I'm saying? And again, in my opinion, looking at North and South, at various regions, even up in the Yellow River Plains and adjacent areas, we have to be very careful about simply using one ethnic term to refer to all these people, because they really are quite disparate populations, as would be the case, I'm sure, in Europe. Do you see what I'm saying? You can't simply say this is a French person in this same period. You have to see who they are, kind of what their kind of connections are with other groups of people, et cetera, et cetera.
Well, I'm definitely looking forward to the next book. I mean, I'm listening to an ebook. It's written for a popular audience in Chinese about the northern and southern dynasties. So yeah, it's very interesting. A lot of interesting stories, wild stories.
They do have some awfully good anecdotes.
Absolutely. I'm at the Battle of Yunbi right now, which is the siege of Yunbi, yeah, with Gao Huan and Yu Wentai.
And my question for these people, because they do speak by the Tang at least, a Yuan really pronounces his name as Yuan. Do you see what I'm saying? Or whatever the Chinese pronunciation was back then. Yuan is, of course, modern Mandarin pronunciation. But up in the garrisons, Yuan Tai and his family, that was a transcription of an Inner Asian name. Do you see what I'm saying? And that for me is the biggest issue. When did they stop pronouncing it as an inter-Asian name and begin to pronounce it as Yuan in Chinese? Because there is that enormous change. And again, that's so I'm not complaining about the histories, but that's just part of what they don't give us. You see they don't say when they're sliding into daily speak in the 6th century version of Chinese.
Yeah, it's certainly an interesting topic. I was reading this book and an article by this Chinese scholar in the United States who was looking at the character ge ge, which used to mean father in the Tang. His argument was that this comes from Xianbei language and it influences Mongolian as well with the Aka and Ini. So yeah, the languages are very fascinating to me as well.
Is that San Ping Chun?
Yes, I was
Who's
thinking.
a friend of mine.
Yeah.
So you should get together and we should have lunch with him sometime.
Yeah, I really enjoyed his research.
Yeah, and so to pick up on that, San Ping does very good work, and there are just other linguists who are really kind of developing the field. And I brought up Andrew Shimanek. He's drawing on things that were done by Beckwith and other people of that sort. That's really important to have a understanding of the complexity. And I'm betting it would be important in your period as well.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. All right, so we're almost at the end of the interview, so I just want to wrap this up with a final concluding question, which is how do you see the role of the Northern Wei in the larger scope of Chinese history? I'm thinking especially in relation to the Sui and Tang dynasties, both of which were descended from these successor states, but even kind of just more broadly as a whole in terms of other conquest dynasties such as the Khitan Liao, the Jurchen Jin, or even the Mongol Yuan.
Yeah. So, I'm working, hopefully I'll get it done. So I did the book on Northern Wei. I'm working on the later Northern dynasties, as they're called, within the Chinese historiographical tradition. And then I really want to push forward and look at the development out of these, because evolving, it does come forth from Northern Wei and the later Northern dynasties. I want to look at Sui and Tang. Do you see what I'm saying? And in fact, Sui is the easiest. Sui just develops, it pops right out of Northern Zhou, as you probably know. So I'm sure there are changes, but it's especially in the Tang. In what ways is Tang drawing upon the structures created by these people of inter-Asian origin? And in what ways is it changing? And it's a little bit of both, as is always the case in human history. Northern Wei is very important in Chinese history, but it's also important in inter-Asian history. In saying that, I'm quoting Luo Xin, if you know Luo Xin, who does excellent work in Chinese on Northern Wei. He's one of the people I've drawn on heavily. And it really is a bit of both. And it's kind of always remembering that there is this ongoing interaction between these different worlds. That has really been obscured in the traditional histories. And I would let you tell me whether Yuan Shi does that or not. But in Wei Shu, a lot of the inter-Asian origin of Northern Wei is swept aside because the people who wrote it, do you see what I mean? Sui Hao, eventually Wei Shou, they're really preoccupied with seeing the structures that come from Han move into these different societies and then move into the Northern Wei. That's what the traditional historians are interested in. And we really do need to see, and again, this would be the same in Iran or Europe or various places, much more of the interaction of multiple societies, and not simply the people from whom the historians come writing the entire story.
Yeah, it's just interesting to think about how the Northern Wei compares to the Mongol Yuan.
Well, one thing I can say, just for much more about the Mongols and the Yuan than do I, but it's really hard for these people to take their apparatus that took shape in Inter-Asia, which is centered on armies, and move it down into the much richer and much more complex Chinese societies to the south. And they do it, as I said at the beginning, because the Chinese world is so rich. And that's just a reality. They don't conquer northern Manchuria or something of that sort. They conquer the Chinese lands. But it's so hard to move their apparatus. And for the Mongols, and again, you know this better than I, but there are at least counterparts that we can see. The difficulty of getting the core of the army to kind of interact and change as they take shape in the Chinese world.
Yeah, and that's something that I will be presenting about at AES next year, is how the Mongol soldiers lived in China, these ethnic Mongols or Turkic peoples when they moved to China, how they lived there. But yeah, I mean, it's a very interesting question with these northern nomadic conquest regimes, the process by which they adapted to rule and life in China.
Very different societies. And again, I'm not putting anybody down. The Chinese world is more complex. I'm not saying inter-Asian populations are lesser in some sense. That's dangerous. But it is a very different world. And I could see that with Northern Wei, just in terms of, and this is maybe true in some ways of Han anyway, but it's just a barter economy. They don't have any coinage at all. They're not making any coinage until they move down to Luoyang, and then it's tiny little kind of centers on this, but they're just not used to what's in the Chinese world. Maybe even more along the Yangtze than up in the Yellow River Plains. But in my opinion, taking the work of Liu Shufan and others, the Yangtze world is really developing economically already in the 400s and the 500s in ways that really set it apart, even from the Chinese of the Yellow River Plain.
Then that could be the topic of another interview, right? Should look at how the southern states are developing during the same time.
You could get Andy Chittick to do that with you. Have you gotten him to do it yet?
No, no.
Oh, Andrew is very good. So if you ever need a recommendation, I would suggest he wrote the book on the Jian Kong Empire. You know about that. And that's on the Southern dynasties. So he would be very good. And maybe we should get together to do a panel comparing and contrasting the Mongols and the Tabgach and the Jurchen or something of that sort. I'm going to definitely go to your panel.
Oh, thank you.
Hearing the soldiery of that period. And if you have time while we're there, maybe I'll email you right before. We could go out for coffee or lunch or something.
Sure, yeah, I would love that. That would be great. Thank you so much.
It was my great pleasure. Thanks.
I guess that concludes our interview. I want to thank you again, Professor Pearce, for giving us so much information on the Tabgach, the Northern Wei, within the span of an hour. I mean, we covered a lot of materials. If people are interested in the details, I would highly recommend them to read your book. And I just want to thank you for your time to come onto the show and give us this information.
It was my pleasure, Yiming. And I look forward to seeing you in Columbus, Ohio.
Likewise. All right.
All right.